Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, what up? Welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you could be with me today. And as you know, I've started a new series of episodes that I'm entitling Understanding Your Story. And last week, I did kind of an introduction, and we covered Principle 1, which is every person's life is made up of many different stories. And I actually have 16 principles that I'm going to be sharing with you guys through this series of episodes, and we've covered just one last week. So we're going to continue this week with Principle 2, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right back in to Understanding Your Story. And Principle 2 is this: stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. And I'd like to start this principle with another metaphor, and it's just a very simple metaphor of a cooking pot. So imagine if you were cooking, like in your kitchen, and you took a big pot out and you put it on the stove, that you could pour some kind of liquid into that pot, right? Like if you poured water into the pot would actually hold the liquid on the inside of it, right? And in much the same way, you guys, what I'm suggesting with this metaphor is that just like the pot can hold water, individual stories from a person's life are like the pot, and these stories can hold power in a person's heart and life. Or said another way, in the same way that you could pour water into a pot, imagine if you could somehow pour power, some powerful emotion, or some powerful force into a story of a person's heart and life. And I think a good way to illustrate the principle that I'm trying to convey here would be the character Jenny from the movie Forrest Gump. Do you remember Jenny? She was Forrest's best friend when he was growing up, and she was his only friend, in fact, when everyone else made fun of him, and they tormented him, they threw rocks at him, they chased him, because you remember he had a physical disability and he wore those braces on his legs and he could hardly walk. And if you remember, Jenny's mother died when she was a little girl, so Jenny is being raised by her father in this little white farmhouse. And it's basically a very uncool situation because Jenny's father is physically and verbally and sexually abusing her. And you might remember this very powerful scene in the movie when Forrest is over at Jenny's house. They're little kids. They're both little kids. And she runs into the cornfield in an attempt to escape her father. And she kneels down to pray in the cornfield. And she says, "Forrest, let's pray. Forrest, let's pray." And she begins to pray to God over and over again. "Please, God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away. Please, God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away. Please, God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away." And you'll remember that after that, throughout the entire movie, Jenny comes in and out of Forrest's life, but she never stays for very long because Jenny can't stay in one place. And she's always on the run, trying to get away from whatever she's trying to get away from, as if she's trying to intuitively answer that prayer that she prayed as a little girl. Wherever I am, this isn't where I want to be. Let me get far away. So this is like a girl and then a woman on the run who's desperately trying to escape something. So we see these different series of scenes throughout the movie. She shows up when Forrest joins the military, and you'll remember this Black Panther slaps Jenny, and Forrest gets into a fist fight with the guy. And then he writes her a letter every day while he's in Vietnam. And then he names his shrimp boat the Jenny when he starts the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company in honor of his friend Bubba from Vietnam. And then later in the movie, Jenny just shows up again one day while Forrest is mowing the grass. And you might remember the scene because, in my estimation, it was very powerful as Forrest offers the following commentary. "And then she was there. Jenny came back and stayed with me. Maybe it was because she had nowhere else to go, or maybe it was because she was so tired. because she went to bed and slept and slept and slept like she hadn't slept in years. It was wonderful having her home. Every day we'd take a walk, and I'd jabber on like a monkey in a tree, and she'd listen about ping-ponging and shrimping and Mama making a trip up to heaven. I did all the talking. Jenny most of the time was real quiet. And then, at that very moment, Forrest and Jenny come around a bend in the path, and suddenly, there it is, right in front of them. The abandoned and dilapidated old white farmhouse that Jenny grew up in with her father all those years ago, where she suffered all that abuse. The old farmhouse where Jenny had suffered the injustices perpetrated against her by her own father when she was a little girl. And at that moment, when Jenny sees the old farmhouse, she freezes in her tracks and stares in a kind of disbelief as if she's just seen a terrible ghost from her past. And then suddenly, she marches toward the house with a kind of angry defiance. And then, as she approaches the house in an absolute outburst of uncontrollable emotion, she first throws her shoes at the house, and then she begins to pick up rocks and hurl them at the house, screaming and muttering under her breath with this unimaginable rage. How could you do this? How could you? Bombarding the walls of the house and breaking the windows until she finally collapses, weeping uncontrollably in an utter heap of exhausted emotion. And it's only then, shocked by this sudden and unexpected outburst of emotion from Jenny, that Forrest slowly approaches her collapsed body on the ground, and he delivers what might be the most memorable line from the movie. Sometimes I guess there just aren't enough rocks. But the point is this, you guys, is stated in our second principle. Stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. In the same way a pot can hold water, you see, stories hold power. And obviously, the story of the white farmhouse from Jenny's past was still holding tremendous power in her heart and life and soul. And that's why she experienced such a sudden and unexpected flood of overwhelming emotion, like a dam bursting when she suddenly saw the house after all those years. You see, the story of the white farmhouse from Jenny's life wasn't just a benign, historical, insignificant event from her past, but it was, in fact, a very significant and alive and powerful event that was still holding tremendous power and authority in her heart and life and soul today in her present reality and experience. And why? Because Principle 2 says stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. So you see, guys, I'd advocate that the stories of our lives don't always just live in our past, as if we could say, oh, that doesn't matter, that happened 27 years ago, so that's gone. It's history. It doesn't matter anymore. It's a pot. Yeah, it's a pot way back in my past 27 years ago, but it's an empty pot. There's nothing in there. No. More often than not, I would suggest, especially for the significant stories of our life, that the pot is back there 27 years ago, but there's something in that pot, and that pot is holding power. Stories hold power. Stories hold incredible, powerful anger. They can hold hurt. They can hold bitterness. They can hold confusion. They can hold fear. They can hold these various dark forces and energies, you see, and these stories are still holding these powers. They're not just benign, historical, insignificant events from the past, because our stories hold power. And that brings me to Principle 3, which is this. Stories can hold a variety of negative and destructive powers within them. And the key word in this principle is the word variety, as in many or more than one or multiple, different, diverse, or an assortment of negative and destructive powers and energy. Or as Principle 3 states, stories can hold a variety of negative and destructive powers within them. So thinking again of the metaphor of the pot, I gave this metaphor, you put a pot on the stove, you could pour a liquid in it like water, and the pot would hold that water, right? But isn't it just as true that a pot could hold a variety of liquids within it all at the same time if you poured a variety of liquids into the pot? Like, what if you poured water in the pot, but then you put some juice, orange juice, in the pot? And then you put some lemonade in the pot, and then some coffee, and maybe a bottle of Coke, and then a bottle of beer, and then some Gatorade. And on it goes, mixing all these liquids up together all at the same time, all in the same pot. So you see, in much the same way, what I'm suggesting is that in the same way a single pot can hold a variety of liquids at the same time, a single story from a person's life can hold a variety of powers, not just one power, but a variety of powers and forces and feelings and energies and dynamics within it all at the same time. And in fact, I'd advocate that we can see this reality in the previously mentioned example of Jenny from the movie Forrest Gump. I can only imagine, as so perfectly illustrated in the scene of her intense emotional collapse and outburst when she's throwing the rocks at the White House, that the one story from her life, that's like one pot, that white farmhouse, but that one story of the white farmhouse from Jenny's past was holding not just one negative and destructive power in her soul, but was in fact holding a variety of negative and destructive powers and forces within her, all mixed up, all at the same time. Like maybe when she saw that farmhouse after all those years, it provoked within her shame and powerlessness and fear and anger and hate and regret and sadness and despair and maybe self-contempt or self-hatred or self-loathing. And God only knows what other dark powers and energies were living in Jenny's heart and soul as a result of what happened to her at that white farmhouse. So we see, guys, that not only do stories hold power in people's hearts and lives, but stories can actually hold a variety of negative and destructive power and energy within them all at the same time. And that brings me to principle 4, which is this: the negative and destructive power that lives in people's stories is like poison in their soul. Many people might try to deny this reality. I hear people do it all the time. And they say things like this: that stuff doesn't matter anymore. It happened so long ago. Bad things happen to everybody. It's no big deal. Out of sight, out of mind. I choose not to think about it. What good does it do to dwell on the past? There's nothing that can be done about it now. I got over that a long time ago. Easy come, easy go. Que sera, sera. It used to bother me, but it doesn't bother me anymore. And do you know what, guys? These people might be very sincere when they say these things, but I'd advocate that they're sincerely wrong. Because just like we illustrated in the example from Jenny's life, there are inevitably certain stories in every person's life that hold profoundly negative and destructive power and energy. You see, that energy and that power wasn't gone. It was still down in Jenny somewhere. And when she saw the farmhouse, it erupted out of her. That story was still holding power in her soul. And so we see that these stories often deposit a kind of poison in the human soul. And this stuff is affecting you more than you know, and in ways that you might not even understand. And just because you don't cognitively comprehend how the harmful stories of your life and past have affected you, it doesn't mean that they haven't affected you, and it doesn't mean that they're not still affecting you. And so I promise you that if you're a human being who's been living in this very broken and fallen world, that certain stories from your life have produced poison in your soul. And this poison has likely affected things that are profoundly complicated, kind of like the iceberg underneath the surface, maybe that we don't connect the dots and we don't cognitively realize how we're still being affected. You see, Jenny, when she saw the house, maybe she was 30 years old, and she probably wasn't consciously realizing or cognitively understanding and connecting the dots how she was still carrying in her soul and life the hurt and the pain from 20 years earlier when she was a little girl and what happened in that house. She wasn't consciously realizing it, but that doesn't change the fact that the power was still there in her soul, and it was still poisoning her in ways that maybe she didn't even understand. And so this poison can affect things like this: you and your relationship with yourself, you and your relationship with others, you and your relationship with God. Or said another way, it's likely affected your self-image or the way you see yourself. It's affected the way you see the world, the way you see others, your ability to trust others, your ability to connect in your relationships on an emotional level. Maybe it's affected how much shame you feel in your heart and life. Wow, did you ever think of that? I think shame is an incredibly powerful, negative, dark force in people's hearts and lives and soul, and they carry this shame with them, and they don't necessarily connect the dots back to some stories in their life when they were 11 years old or 14 or 15 or 17 years old, when certain things happened to them or when they did certain things, and that in these stories this power of shame was deposited, and they've been carrying that shame with them ever since then, you see, because stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. Or maybe there's been poison deposited in a person's soul, and it's affecting maybe their relationship with sex, how they see sex, how they feel about sex. Maybe it affects whether or not they can control sex or whether sex is controlling them. Maybe there's power in the stories of your past that are still today affecting your ability to be emotionally present to your partner during sex. Maybe it's affected how honest and vulnerable you can be with yourself, with others, and with God. It's likely affected how you talk to yourself, your self-talk, how you talk to others, how you talk to God. Maybe it's affected the kind of decisions and choices that you've made in your life. Maybe it's affected the kind of people that you've chosen to hang around with. Wow. Last episode, I was talking about the people in prison when we go to do prison ministry, and how if we could chain together and follow the stories of their life, it would make sense how they ended up incarcerated in the state of Missouri. So could it be that certain stories in their life, that power was placed in some of the stories of their lives that began to affect them in negative and harmful and hurtful ways, and that in turn began to affect decisions and choices they were making, and that began to affect the kind of people they were hanging around, the crowd they were in, and therefore the things that they were beginning to do that eventually led them to be incarcerated. And it goes all the way back to their stories and the power that was in their stories that began to affect them in ways that maybe they never comprehended or understood about themselves. Maybe the power that lives in people's stories is still affecting the kind of husband they can be today, or the kind of wife they can be, or the kind of friend or father or mother or brother or sister or boss, or the kind of Christian that they're able to be. And believe me when I say that this list could go on and on and on, because people's lives are profoundly affected by the power that lives in their story. So whatever you do, do not try to convince me that your stories from the past are no big deal. And don't try to convince me that certain stories from your life have not held power in them and deposited poison in your soul. And don't say to me things like, oh, that stuff doesn't matter anymore. It happened so long ago. Bad things happen to everybody. It's no big deal. What good does it do to dwell on the past? Because I have no doubt whatsoever that virtually every single human being has been deeply and profoundly hurt and wounded and broken because of living in this fallen world. And I'll just mention one thought here that occurs to me. When I'm teaching, if I'm able to, I love to show video clips. And sometimes I wish that I had that ability to do that, but since this is a podcast format, people can only listen, they can't see. I would love to play different video clips from different movies to illustrate different principles. But I'm thinking right now of a movie that I think is an incredibly awesome movie, and I encourage you to see it if you've never seen it. If you have seen it, maybe you should watch it again. It's called Life as a House, and it has Kevin Kline in it. And Kevin Kline plays a character that discovers that he's dying from cancer. And this man is divorced. He's separated from his family. He has a teenage son, and his son is very angry and bitter. And the son is kind of gothic, and he has dark hair and wears dark black clothes. And as the movie unfolds, you can just see from the attitude and the demeanor of this young man, this teenager, the absolute poison that lives in his soul, the anger and the hate and the bitterness and the resentment, just this horrible attitude and presence that this young man has. And so I would just ask this question, why do you think this young man is like this? Where is this power coming from, this dark force, this energy that just surrounds him and swirls around him? And I would advocate and suggest that it comes from the stories of his life. Even though he's a teenager, he's a young person, but already these stories have been unfolding in his life, and his stories are holding power. Anger is being placed in his stories, and bitterness and resentment and rage is being placed in his stories. And you can see it so clearly in this young man's heart and life. And this affirms to us Principle 4, the negative and destructive power that lives in people's stories is like poison in their soul. And that brings me to Principle 5 of understanding your story, which is this. Some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. And I think this principle basically goes without saying, but it's a very important principle, so I'm saying it, even though it goes without saying. Some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. In fact, an intervention that I've used frequently as a counselor is an exercise that I call the top 10. And with this exercise, I ask people to make a list of the top 10 most wounded, broken, and painful events and or stories of their life. Or said another way, if you looked over the landscape of your entire life and you had to pick out the 10 most hurtful and painful events and or stories of your life, which 10 stories would you pick? And of course, some people might immediately have an allergic reaction to this exercise, and they might say something like, why in the world would I want to make a list of the 10 worst things that have ever happened in my life? Because I'd rather not think about those things, and I'd rather leave them in the past. And I certainly don't want to make a list of them. But the fact is, there's actually several very important reasons for this exercise, and I'll share just 3. Number 1, it helps a person identify the most wounded, broken, and painful places of their life and soul. Number 2, it helps a person identify the painful stories of their life that they have likely attempted to medicate and or anesthetize in unhealthy, if not destructive ways. Or said another way, this exercise might help a person begin to identify the origins or the sources or the beginnings of the most unhealthy and destructive habits and behaviors and hang-ups and addictions of their life. And number 3, it helps a person identify the areas of their heart and life and soul where they most need the healing and redemption of God. So the fact is, I'd advocate that it's very important for people to understand that some stories hold more power in their heart and life than other stories. And not only that, but it's important for people to identify those most powerful and hurtful stories from their life, because it's often these very stories that have held and continue to hold the most damaging and hurtful and destructive and toxic or poison power in their life and soul. And as an example of this principle, I'll mention the story of my wife's rape. And for those of you that know our story, you know that my wife, Sherry, was raped when she was 13 years old. And for our purpose here, I'm not going to go into all the gory details of that particular story of her life, except to mention two particular observations about this story. And the first one is this, that this story, the story of Sherry's rape, is included on the top 10 list of her life. Or said another way, obviously her rape is among the most hurtful and painful and toxic events of her life. And my second observation is this, that this one story from Sherry's life held amazing and significant and radical power in her heart and life and soul for years and years to come. And why? Because as we're learning in Principle 5, some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. And by the way, isn't it kind of interesting to think that something can happen in a person's life on one particular day, maybe when they happen to be 13 years old, or maybe they were 9 years old, or maybe they were 14 years old, and as a result of that single event that occurred in their life on that single day, that their life will be forever and unalterably changed, that the entire trajectory of their life has been so radically altered by that single event that happened on that single day of their life, that it will radically affect who they are and who they become, and it will forever radically and powerfully change the direction and the flavor of their life. And I'd suggest that virtually every person's life inevitably has particular events and stories that have occurred that have significantly and powerfully and radically affected them in profound and incomprehensible ways that have hurt and harmed their life. And why? Because Principle 5 says that some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. And in the way of one more example, I have no doubt that in my own life, I can identify certain events and stories that happened to me, or said another way, in the metaphor of the jigsaw puzzle, I can identify certain pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of Tony's life that had unbelievable power and that would radically affect my life in hurtful and harmful ways for years to come. For example, when I was 10 years old, I found my father's stash of pornography and XXX books. And it'd be hard for me to put to words, you guys, how profoundly and powerfully and dramatically that event, that single event of finding my father's pornography, would contribute and influence the trajectory of my life for years and years to come. And why? Because some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. And without a doubt, finding my dad's porn was a very significant, powerful story of my life and past. And by the way, guys, before we leave this point, I'd like to share just one other significant observation about this concept of the top 10 list. And the observation is this, that the items that you include on your top 10 list could represent what I would call either an event or an environment. And let me try to explain the difference. An event is something that happened on one particular day of your life, one moment in time, such as the day that you were raped, the day your little sister was killed in the car accident, the day your father left your family, or the day you got beat up by your best friend. You see, these are situations that occurred in your life as an event, one particular event on one particular day. An environment, on the other hand, represents a situation in your life that was ongoing over a prolonged period of time, say, such as your father's anger, or your mother's alcoholism, or your physical disability, or your special needs brother, or the sexual abuse that your uncle perpetrated against you over a period of several years. You see, these things represent difficult and painful situations that didn't happen just one time, one event on one day, but were in fact situations in your life that were ongoing for perhaps months or even years. So sometimes the most hurtful and painful situations of your life were events, and sometimes they were an environment. And in fact, two good examples to illustrate this distinction would be the very same two examples I just reviewed in this point of Sherry and myself. Sherry's rape, you see, was an event because it happened one moment in time on one particular day of her life. And me finding my dad's pornography was an environment because it didn't just happen one time on one day, but it became an ongoing situation that I became involved with over a prolonged period of time. So again, your top 10 list could include either events or environments that were hurtful or harmful to your life. But either way, these situations, whether they're an event or an environment, represent the most difficult stories of your life, and they affirm the reality that some stories from people's lives hold more power than other stories. And guys, with that being said, I see from the clock that I'm over time today, so I'm going to have to wrap up this episode of the Power of Purity podcast. I hope you can be with me next week as we continue our journey of understanding the story of your life. God bless you. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, and have a great day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.